Let me welcome you and thank you for joining us for another Stegner Center Natural Resources Law Forum Green Bag presentation. Today we have a particularly timely presentation on America's national parks, given the fact that 2016 is the centennial year for the creation of our national park system and the National Park Service, which oversees the parks that so many of us love and cherish. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just provide a little information about some upcoming Stegner Center events. March 30th, as a lead-in to this year's 21st Annual Stegner Center Symposium, we'll be hosting here at over the noon hour Professor Larry Susskind from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as the Wallace Stegner lecturer leading into our symposium. He will be addressing the topic of managing climate risks in resilient cities. And then the following 2 days, Thursday and Friday, March 31st, April 1st, we'll be addressing the topic in our annual symposium of green infrastructure, resilient cities, new challenges, new solutions. The program will include some discussion of the new law building and the sustainability features that we find here. I should note that the early registration fee ends on March 15th for that symposium, so if you're contemplating joining us, be aware of that date and save a few bucks. Two other Stegner Center events before as we wrap up the spring academic semester. On April 14th, as part of the Green Bag series, we'll host Joe Bushyhead from the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, who will address the question of RS 2477 update, the Quiet Title Act and Utah's biggest lawsuit. This addresses the question of ownership of roads running across public lands. And then we'll conclude on April 18th with a presentation as part of our lecture series. The program is entitled Greater Yellowstone Migrations Project. National Geographic wildlife photographer Joe Reese will be joining us along with his colleague Arthur Middleton, who's a research scientist at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, who will be presenting research through photographs of wildlife migration corridors and routes that they have documented in the Greater Yellowstone area. Now it's my pleasure to introduce both a friend and a colleague, and that is David Nimkin, who is the Senior Regional Director for the National Parks Conservation Association's Southwest region, where he and his team oversee and protect national parks in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. David's had a lengthy career and a diverse career. I'll share some of the highlights of it with you. He's been with NPCA now for a decade, approximately. I had the privilege of helping to get the Southwest Region Office up and running a decade ago as a member of the Board of Trustees for NPCA. But prior to that, David served as Chief of Staff to Salt Lake City Mayor Rocky Anderson. He's been a partner at Confluence Associates, which is a private firm that's engaged in sustainable development projects throughout the western United States. He's former state director of the Utah Small Business Development Centers, which was housed at the David Eccles School of Business here at the university. He's founder and longtime board chair of Utah Microenterprise Loan Fund. He's also the co-founder and current board co-chair of Buy Local First Utah. He served as first executive director for the Salt Lake Neighborhood Housing Services and as president and CEO of the Corporate Fund for Housing in Los Angeles when he took a vacation from Utah briefly. He's also has the distinction of serving as a board member on the San Francisco branch of the Federal Reserve Board. But his topic today and what he's most known for these days is the national parks. And David, we look forward to hearing from you about our parks. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. Is this working? Can you hear me okay for this mic? I don't think I'm going to stand behind the lectern here. Thank you, Bob, and thank the law school for giving me the opportunity to visit with you over the next few minutes. As Bob mentioned, I am the regional director for a group called the National Parks Conservation Association, and oftentimes people look at me and wonder when I talk about what I do. They said, National Parks Conservation, aren't you guys a little redundant? I mean, isn't there some other kind of protection that's being done with the parks? And I think that's very true, and part of what I'm going to be sharing with you over the next little bit is description and discussion of kind of the great, extraordinary, one of the benefits you have with this kind of presentation is that you get to show some very pretty pictures, but also then sort of represent, some of you may already know that, but hopefully this will edify some of that for you. Let me see if I get this right. As you all know, and as Bob identified in his introduction, this is the Centennial year, and I feel a little bit uneasy with the kind of expertise in this room about national parks. And as Bob mentioned, I have a fairly eclectic background, but one of the things I think we probably all share is a great love and affinity with these special places, and indeed how fortunate we are in the state of Utah to have the Mighty Five and the other special 8 units of the National Park System, and how wonderful they are. And this year we are in fact celebrating their centennial and the centennial of the National Park Service. And it was Stephen Mather, whom, I don't know if this works, this little, whoops, I don't know if that is going to work, but anyway, there's a great opportunity, obviously, in this centennial year to sort of reimagine what our national parks can be, what they should be, and how they will ultimately be protected. I might add that Stephen Mather, who is it says former NPS director, he was the first National Park Service director, and he actually was the founder of our organization, the National Parks Conservation Association, recognizing as he began his government service that the kind of advocacy work that helped to create the parks, helped to create the National Park Service, indeed, that in a role in government, he would be constrained in doing that, and felt there was a need for a citizen's effort to help to create and protect our national parks. Nevertheless, having said all of that, and this is a graphic representation of a campaign we have undertaken, and I will relate a little bit more about that in near term. But as we approach in this centennial year and the end of the Obama administration, there's a very strong effort to sort of re-engage the public and capture the imagination of the public for how at risk our parks are. And these are a little bit artistic license, but we've taken 9 national parks that are iconic in their very nature and identified a range of threats that they face that really in this current year, this administration can take some actions that will help protect them for these purposes. I'll talk about some of the things related to Arches and Grand Canyon in my talk, but this is intended to look more broadly, and I'll get to that. So maybe many of you have seen this, know this, but the underpinnings of the national park system are really contained very simply in a 1916 act, the Organic Act, and I won't read it for you, but the underlined words of conserve, enjoy, and leave unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations is at the center of that. And while that is very clearly the responsibility, the mission of the National Park Service, their ability and the hard work they do in managing these places is limited by virtue of many factors, some of which I'll talk about, not the least of which is as government employees and their ability to be advocates. We are, in fact, the advocates for this system. This is a map you probably can't see very well, but it is a map of all 409 national park units in the United States. My pointer isn't working here, but I did want to highlight, if you can look at our region in the country, the heavy concentration of national parks that we have right here and how fortunate we are. In fact, of the, so what are national parks? Sometimes people are often a little troubled by the different names that are applied to units of the system that are managed by the National Park Service, but they are both iconic landscapes that are sort of represented here, as well as the mall in Washington, D.C., as well as the ongoing and evolving history of the United States, from new national park units like the Manhattan Project that I'll talk about in a little bit, down in 3 locations in New Mexico, recognizing Cesar Chavez, obviously Martin Luther King, and of course the ancestral Puebloan ruins here and culture in the Southwest. This is an evolving story of the American past, the American history, and is an important element in the ongoing evolution of the National Park System, the National Park Service. As I mentioned, our organization, and just briefly, we're almost 100 years old ourselves. We operate 11 regions around the country. We have 23 field offices and over 1 million members and supporters. Hopefully some of you are included in that class. It's an organization of about 160 people, maybe 40% of whom are in the regions, a very strong presence in Washington, D.C., working on lobbying efforts and advocacy efforts with Congress and the administration. In the Southwest, of the 409 units, and you saw that concentration of parks, 64 of them are just here in the Southwest, in these 4 corner states. In fact, the heaviest concentration of national park units in the entire country is on the Colorado Plateau, which should not be a surprise to any of us that live here and enjoy these places and these parks. We operate, as Bob indicated, with a headquarters here in Salt Lake City, and then we have field staff in a Colorado field office in Boulder, a field person doing energy work in the Four Corners area in Grand Junction, Arizona field office in Tucson, and currently recruiting for a new field office in New Mexico. I'm likely hoping it'll be Santa Fe, but we don't know. So if you have any good candidates, send them my way. The idea of the second century for the national parks was something that has captivated the imagination of our organization for many years. It's something that our leadership, including Bob Kiter and others, helped to organize a commission 8 years ago that met for a couple of years to envision what a second century of the national parks would look like. And a very high-powered, influential team of people on that commission that included 2 former senators, people like E.O. Wilson, Sandra Day O'Connor, local product Meg Wheatley, and others, Sally Jewell, who at that time was on the board of directors of NPCA, didn't know she'd become the Secretary of the Interior one day. But that group actually looked at ways that and this is a summary of this, could envision what a next century of the national parks would look like. Certainly recognizing that in the 21st century, that the idea that was captured as America's best idea would be something that would evolve and strengthen in the second century, that both the stewardship of the existing parks and really the citizen advocacy, the recognition that these are places that belong to all of us. There's a common bond among all citizens in the United States that have visited national parks, and that number's over 300 million people a year, that's a shared common experience. And in this current election cycle, there aren't a lot of shared common experiences that as Americans we seem to enjoy these days, but that's one of the powers that the national parks offer. And that the National Park Service itself, which for over a decade has been underfunded, undercapitalized, really constrained in doing their work, that they can be effective stewards in fulfilling the responsibilities they have under the Organic Act, and that the funding that is a core part of that can be sustained, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. In order to talk a little bit about the kind of threats that the parks face, as important as they are and the values that they contribute, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the kinds of threats that we're addressing in the Southwest among the parks that we engage. They are somewhat unique to the national parks in the Southwest, but not really unique to the national park system and the kinds of things that we're engaged in. And I'll spend a little bit of time going through each of these. First, and I know that there have been Stegner symposia on these matters, relate to air quality. And we're certainly in the middle of coal country here in the Southwest, and consequently have some of the largest coal-fired power plants in North America that operate here. The impact specifically to air quality is something that is regulated by the Regional Haze Rule in the Clean Air Act. And so specifically that states that air in and around our national parks that are so designated and wilderness areas will maintain Class 1 air sheds. Those are very difficult to sustain with the burning of coal and other fossil fuels. And so we've been working, as long as I've been involved with NPCA in 10 years, in helping to enforce the Regional Haze Rule, most specifically in Utah. And currently there is a item before the EPA presently that they are looking at a couple of choices. One would put selective catalytic, SCR, on the coal-fired power plants in Hunter and Huntington in Utah that have profound impact on the air quality at Canyonlands National Park, or a sort of no action alternative that they're being considered. That's something that the EPA will decide in the next month or so and make some judgments about it. But the impact is really quite profound, and you can see it just in these photographs. I think a lot of people who visit the wonderful vistas we have in our national parks are consistently confounded by the accumulation of haze. A substantial part of that haze is due to the burning of the coal-fired power plants at Hunter and Huntington. Similarly, there's a huge challenge with energy development. It's often been said, even at a time when energy prices are so low that the development of energy in and around our national parks on the Colorado Plateau and the energy resources that exist here is comparable to that in Saudi Arabia. And certainly when the prices were higher, there was enormous pressure to do that. And some of you, I'm sure most of you may recall that in 2008, the conflicts at the end of the Bush administration that resulted in the leasing of parcels around Arches and Canyonlands National Park and actually up at Dinosaur, ultimately halted by Secretary of Interior Salazar for a period of a year or so, while they looked at the whole process of how energy was being developed, how oil and gas leases were supported. Part of that was that the large resource management plans that the 6 districts of the BLM, where these energy zones were identified, are really large blocks of territory that don't really look at the granularity and the specific nature of where these could be. And so if a company wants to lease a parcel, they need identify that to the BLM, and the BLM on their regular pattern of leases make those available. What often then would happen is that those parcels where the development was leased, with a lease was sold, would often be in conflict with some of the specific values of the national parks or other conservation values, and that would often lead to litigation and conflict. So what happened during the tenure of Salazar was the development of something called a master lease plan, and that was specifically oriented towards the problems that ensued in Utah, because those resource management plans had just been completed, had just been approved by the Secretary of the Interior at the end of Bush, and the kind of authorities that allowed energy companies to bid on leases around the parks that had been sort of a gentleman's agreement prior to that, that they would not be put up for sale, were ignored, and that's what led to the problem. And so the basic tenet of the master lease plan, which is something that we're advancing, is a way to at least plan and look more granularly at the kinds of impacts that the leases would have on national park units and other values that are recognized, whether it's wildlife habitats or it's air quality or other archaeological site considerations could be considered first and foremost. The kind of work that's being done with the master lease plans include all of these parks that we're currently working in, and it's a process of engaging the BLM and other stakeholder interests in trying to sort that out. Presently, the Moab master lease plan is in draft stage. Comments have been received, and we're expecting a final EIS on that in the next several months. We hope it would be sooner. It will probably be in the fall. What I wanted to just show you and put this in some context is Chaco. And how many of you have been to Chaco Culture National Historic Park? A small number. You should really go, because it really is the center of the ancestral Puebloan world. Incredible place, very remote. You'll note that the park is a very small part of that landscape, but the larger, greater Chacoan landscape includes elements of that culture, dating back over 1,000 years. And the impact of oil and gas development in that area is really quite profound. And what the black dots represent are active oil and gas leases. It's in areas, if you can see on the green there, I don't have this pointer, but is the great roads that emanate from the cultural center. And the added complexity, and this is one of the unique elements, in Moab, for example, some of the values and interests that are trying to be sustained or retained are recreation values. The enormous growth of off-road mountain bikes and even off-road vehicles and other kinds of things is a value that has become important for that community and others. At Chaco, the other element here is that these lands also include Navajo Nation lands, both that include land that is managed by the Navajo Nation, held in trust by the federal government, as well as lands that are allotted to certain Navajo families. And so the complexity of trying to balance protecting the greater Chacoan landscape from the assaults of energy development, and as important that is, with the economic benefit that some of the Navajo families that have allotments on the Navajo Nation becomes a bit of a challenge. And that's something that we're trying to work through. And, honestly, a big challenge is getting the agencies of the federal government, the BLM, the BIA, and the Park Service to work well together. But some of our role is working in that realm. These are examples, similar kinds of considerations around Mesa Verde. A new one is being developed that will be around Capitol Reef, and another actually in San Juan, hopefully that will be initiated in the next year that will include Canyonlands. Another big part of the challenge, and was certainly represented in the Second Century Commission, is that national parks in and of themselves are not islands. They're part of large, fragile, sometimes should be protected landscapes, but often are not. And so Canyonlands is a case in point. And for decades, in fact, Bob Kiter had written an article some 30 years ago, maybe 25 years ago in our magazine, calling for the completion of Canyonlands. If you look down from the rim of what is Canyonlands, that area, a good part of it is not within the national park itself. And while originally conceived as something that would be contained by the natural erosional basin of Canyonlands, the actually squared off boundaries of the park, as you can see in the pink there, don't necessarily reflect that. So we've long advocated for the completion of Canyonlands and looking for other ways that could be sustained. But it's also reflective of, I think, our notions that national parks are indeed part of these larger landscapes. We have participated quite assertively in the Bishop Public Land Initiative that came out finally in January of this year. And this, I just look at the title, and I think our experience for all the work we did and advocating for the kinds of things that we had done, just, the day after it came out, just called it a missed opportunity, that there was a lot that could be done. We haven't seen what the bill will finally look like. By the way, there's a citizens hearing tomorrow night that some of you may know about at Orson Spencer Hall at 6:30 p.m. Stephen Trimble, who's here, will be moderating that. But partly because that process really didn't offer an opportunity for the larger public, certainly along the Wasatch Front, to participate. Certainly a stakeholder group like NPCA participated, but others haven't had a chance to add voice to this. And so before a bill is finally submitted, that's part of what that will offer. At the same time, we've been tracking what some of you might know about is Bears Ears National Monument. And one of the things I would note there, this is something that now, initially conceived by a group of Navajo from Utah, it has now incorporated 5 tribes. And I won't try to repeat that, but you'll notice the scale of that area and how substantially it would protect the areas that we've held dear. There are certainly questions about it. There is a proposal that it be collaboratively managed by the 5 tribes and the public land managers. There are questions about, national park inholdings in a national monument like Glen Canyon or Natural Bridges or indeed Canyonlands, and those would certainly need to be worked out. But, from our perspective, This holds great promise. We're anxious to see what happens. We had only wished and hoped that the bill that had been developed by our delegation would be incorporating some of the conservation values that we've been advocating for a long, long time. One of the most iconic places on the planet, indeed one in our region, is the Grand Canyon. And I use this as an example to certainly represent how our parks are facing almost a death by 1,000 cuts. And you could slice and dice, forgive the analogy, the nature of the kinds of threats that the canyon is facing. And any one would be substantial, but because it's so vast and in fact sometimes resilient to so many things, it's sort of overlooked. But I'll go through each of these very quickly and note some of you have read about the Escalade project. This is a project, and this is part of the issue and challenge in dealing in our part of the world with substantial areas that are reservation land, Indian land, and the economic challenges that are faced there lead to projects like this. This is something that has been promoted by an Arizona developer. It is intended to be on the rim of the Grand Canyon, right at the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River. It is not something, however, I might add, that is managed by the National Park Service because it's on Navajo land, and they can do this. What it has upset is a huge number of enrolled tribal members who recognize the significance of the Little Colorado River, its traditional values, and the current president of the Navajo Nation, as well as the majority of its tribal council, are opposed to this. My fear is that this isn't a permanent protection. Like so many other things, as an administration changes, this may have some future. What this would involve is hotels, and it would involve a gondola that would take people down to the confluence, and a boardwalk that would go right to the confluence, which is for many, if not most, of the affiliated tribes around the Grand Canyon, one of the most sacred places in the canyon where their creation stories ensue. So we're certainly tracking that, but it is internally a Navajo matter at this point. You may have heard as well about, and this is on the Parks in Peril, is a huge development that's proposed in the gateway community of Tucson, a town of about 500 people on the South Rim. And there are about 4.5 million people every year that pass through that little town. And for decades, there have been proposals and plans to develop that to attract and garner the revenues that 4.5 million people can create. And so what's proposed is upwards of 3 million square feet of commercial space and 2,200 housing units. So put that in perspective, that's about the size of the Mall of America or 10 Walmarts, just to put that in perspective. And the housing, if you only have a community of 500 people, 2,200 housing units is a lot. Obviously, the critical factor there is water. It's the desert. The unique hydrology of the Grand Canyon would be profoundly impacted with the development of that scale. And the nexus in order to get to that private inholding, which is really within yards of the rim of the south rim of the Grand Canyon, is a right-of-way that's required over the Kaibab National Forest. And so we've petitioned, and we had tens of thousands of comments with our allies to ask the U.S. Forest Service to at least have an EIS, deny it outright because of the public interest that would be violated by that scale of development on so many levels, but at least do an EIS so larger impacts could be considered. That hasn't been determined yet, but that's something that we're asking this administration to rule on that before the end of this year. I wanted to highlight the uranium mining. This was something just as recently as 6 or 7 years ago. There were thousands of leased uranium mines or planned uranium mines in and around the Grand Canyon. Through a lot of efforts and the work ultimately of Secretary Salazar, there is a 20-year moratorium on uranium mining around the Grand Canyon. We're about 5 years into that. And so that's not permanent. It's something that ultimately could be sustained. Legislation has been submitted by Arizona Congressman Raul Grijalva, and there's a national monument proposal called the Greater Grand Canyon Heritage National Monument that is also under consideration. But these are threats. There are already some existing and sort of grandfathered in uranium mines or zombie mines that have begun operations. And so we're seeing experience of that. And I might add that that moratorium, all 11 affiliated tribes opposed the uranium mining and supported the moratorium, as well as Southern Nevada Water Authority. There are some 25 million people downstream here that have an interest in that. This is an issue, and it's in the news currently. Hybrid buffalo or hybrid or beefalo is a problem that has happened on the North Rim with a hybrid strain of bison that were crossbred with cattle in the early part of the 20th century because it was recognized that bison were able to sustain cold winters. It gets really cold on the North Rim. Well, the rancher that started doing that crossbreeding left, but the bison herd or the beefalo herd sustained, and because of hunting in the Coconino Forest, that they've migrated into the park and causing, there may as 600 to 800 beefalo in the North Rim right now that are causing problems to the water, to the flora in the area. And there's a current plan now to ultimately figure out how to deal with that, some of which could be removal. But one of the insidious natures of this is that the Arizona delegation has been putting in riders that would allow hunting in the Grand Canyon, and that is not something as a precedent that we would like to see. And so that's a current issue right now with a management plan that is under consideration. But I wanted to raise with this is also a larger issue in our national parks where you have invasive species, whether it's tamarisk on the Colorado River or it's humpback and it's trout and humpback chub in the Colorado River, buffalo grass in the Sonoran Desert. These are ongoing challenges, and this is just one example of some of that. Air overflights, ongoing issue. I've been down on Hermit's Rest around the Grand Canyon, helicopters hovering overhead about one every 90 seconds. So the intrinsic value of silence in our national parks and how important that is for the millions of people that visit there every year is really compromised by overflights. Some of the authority after years of negotiation to manage this was lost by some congressional action about 6 years ago or so, but it's still an ongoing challenge. Infrastructure, you've heard the news about the $12 billion of infrastructure backlog in our national parks, due in no small measure to the limited funding that the parks have received and how compromised the parks are. About 150 million of that is the pipeline that comes from the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, that carries all the water that's used on the South Rim. And that's over almost 60 years old. In order to repair that, which is something that's required every year, it's not an easy thing to repair, as you can see, and how difficult it is. The cost of replacing it is about $150 million. One can imagine what would happen, and there are contingency plans if that line broke and you have 4.5 million people wanting to get to the South Rim of the Grand Canyon and no water, they'd have to truck it in. And then not least of which is what we imagine and recognize as our national parks is our rangers, the people that provide the law enforcement, the interpretation, the protection of these places, the annual operating shortfall for the National Park Service, and this is sustained over a decade, is about $500 million. And so all of the national park managers who, as we said, are there to protect these places are really challenged by how limited and difficult it is when they have 2 and 3 jobs that they have to do. I just want to speak briefly about the Colorado River. And as we face a period of drought and impact from climate change, the Colorado River is very significant for the work we do. There are 10 national park units that are literally defined by the Colorado River, beginning in the headwaters up at Rocky Mountain National Park and ending from the park's perspective at Lake Mead. Many people look at the Colorado River as a plumbing system. And certainly we think of that in many ways. This is a famous diagram that was once in High Country News, looking at how that water is developed and managed for the betterment of our growth and development and our economies, all solid. But you put that in context to a report that was just completed in the last couple of years that really legitimized what is a long-held fear that we are outstripping what is the likely future of our water supply in the Colorado River system. And the only good news in that is as you look at the tail end of that curve on water use in, up to 2008, that there at least is a slowing down of some of the demand, that some of the conservation measures have peaked. I'm not sure that's always going to be the case, but we're certainly facing in the context of a changing climate and in the throes of one of the worst droughts in recorded history, a real challenge for how we use and manage this water. From our perspective, there are elements with the Colorado River that need to consider environmental and recreational flows and values that need to be sustained. And we've been working with many others to help do that. I know I need to move quickly through this. I wanted to note that among the things that we help to promote are new parks, both the landscapes that are unprotected and that represent enormous and remarkable values, as well as historical parks. This one is Valles Caldera in northwestern New Mexico. Through advocacy that we did and others, helped to protect this 90,000 acre Caldera, which is second only to the Yellowstone caldera in significance and remarkably beautiful, as well as the Manhattan Project that is now in Hanford, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, as a way to interpret and help the American public to understand the atomic age, for better or for worse, but really a role that the National Park Service plays. Recognizing how important the national parks are underscored when the government closed down 3 years ago and how profound that was felt in the state of Utah. These are some of the numbers that represent the economic impact of these places and how increasingly important they are for building and sustaining the local economic base. But there's an issue with that. Look at the scale of just our Utah parks and the amount of increase in visitation. So certainly the Mighty 5 campaign that the Office of Tourism has initiated has had an impact. I think the increased numbers of people that want to come visit our national parks in this state is profound, but this is what it yields. This is kind of experience at Zion National Park just last year, and something that communities are facing with profound impacts, not only in being able to manage and maintain the parks with this crush of visitation. That's not just Utah. This is happening at the Grand Canyon. It's happening at Rocky Mountain National Park. These are wonderful places to visit, and they're open and accessible for everybody. and the kind of expectations that people have about going to a park, these sanctuaries, these cathedrals, doesn't necessarily fit the reality, whether you're walking through the Narrows, you're waiting for a shuttle bus at Zion. And so the challenge that I think we face, and certainly around Arches and at Zion, the management of those parks are looking at ways that they're going to control and look at how visitation needs to be managed. You can't just keep building parking lots and in the parks and maintain that kind of experience. But those are some of the threats. 2 years ago, we organized a Gateway Forum in Utah. We had 25 communities, self-identified, public land managers from the BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, state parks, really beginning to look at ways that unique interests and opportunities and challenges that they all faced could be dealt with collaboratively. And that's been an ongoing effort, and we're initiating another one in Colorado in April. And I think what we recognize is the experience that people have when they visit our national parks is often shaped not only by the experience in the park, but the experience they have in the Gateway community and the kind of reception they get from locals. And what's happening in places like Springdale and Moab is that the quality of life of people who live there, even though it's their golden egg, is being challenged by just the sheer magnitude of visitation there. And so finally, coming back to this, if anything, and in this centennial year, if we are going to reinforce the kind of values that we held out in the Second Century Commission, the kinds of future that the national parks face, at a minimum, we need as citizens, as people who care about these places, whether they're in our own backyard or they're places that are in other parts of the country, that we need to stand up and say, you know, these are things that this year, this administration, you can take care of, whether it's private land in holdings at Grand Teton, or it's air at Yosemite, which has some of the dirtiest air in the country at times. Whether it's management of bison, a symbol that's on the arrowhead of the national park symbol, or an industrial scale solar farm in the Mojave Desert, or as we already mentioned, the oil and gas development. It doesn't quite look like, we had people look at that and say, I've been to the Delicate Arch, I don't see those oil rigs there. But nevertheless, there's a challenge, and it's really the advocacy and the diligence of citizens to really make that happen. So this is an ongoing campaign and something on our website, that npca.org, that you can follow and add your voice to if you can. Anyway, so do we have wonderful, extraordinary national parks? Absolutely we do, and we're very fortunate for the wisdom and foresight of the people that helped to create them. But they are not to be taken lightly. They're not to be taken for granted. And realistically, every park has had a core of citizens that helped shape their protection and their future. And that's something that every generation needs to maintain. So, thank you. I'll take any questions if you have any. Yes, sir. Oh, we have a mic here. It's good.
Last spring, on one occasion, Arches National Park was totally closed to new people coming in because they didn't have a place to put them. What is the Park Service planning to do about that?
They're currently, you all heard the question, right? So the park has been looking at this as a problem. The reason it was closed, it was actually closed by the Highway Patrol because the backlog of people going into the park was so long. It was going back all the way back towards town to the bridge across the Colorado River. And the cars that were hurtling down the hill coming from the north, waiting to make a left turn, created a safety hazard, as you can just imagine how that was. And this was at Memorial Day, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So the Park Service has looked at a number of different options, and they have an EIS process underway, and it's, I think they call it a traffic mitigation plan, because it is about traffic. Over the years, they've increased the number of parking lots. They've been looking at the possibility of a shuttle system that would kind of be like the one at Zion, which has had great success. The challenge with that is the distances that are within the park, much greater distances, longer times, more exposure for people, you know, waiting for a shuttle to come through. And these are very costly as well. So they are looking at a number of options, one of which might require a reservation system to even get into the park, maybe during peak times, or a sliding fee schedule that would encourage people to come earlier or later, so that the numbers of people could be managed. I think some of the way we viewed it is that the experience of visiting Arches National Park should not be looking for a parking space. And that's, for many people, what it's become. So I can't tell you exactly the timing of that EIS process, but they are in the midst of reviewing comments that have been received. Yes, sir. Well, we have another mic here, so. Oh, you got a loud voice, okay.
I'm curious about the friction between enjoyment and preservation ever since the parks were created. It seems to me that at some date, hard choices may have to be made about like enjoyment have to be reduced certain in favor of preservation. I kind of wonder what the Park Service is thinking about that.
Sure. Did everyone hear that question? The question was the contrast between protection and enjoyment. And as we see the slides of people, you know, crowding up at the Narrows at Zion, or, you know, waiting in line to get on the shuttle, is there a point when that needs to be changed? First of all, from the standpoint of the National Park Service, I think they're very concerned about it. And I have to say, it's a little bit schizophrenic, maybe. On one level, there is a campaign that the National Park Service has adopted in the Centennial year called Find Your Park, which is, you know, certainly encouraging people to come visit national parks and, you know, find it. And some of it is not only national parks, it's city parks, it's, you know, any park, but get outdoors. And so I support that, and I think it's good. But at the same time, there's a clear recognition they're profoundly underfunded. They can't maintain the trails, they can't maintain the toilets. One of the biggest challenges they have at Zion National Park, the rangers tell me, is removing the pit toilets at Angel's Landing. I mean, they didn't used to have those. Now they have them, and they have to remove them by helicopter, and it's very dangerous and kind of nasty work, to say the least. So I think there is concern about it. I'm not sure I could tell you, and maybe others could share what the perspective in the National Park Service is. I do know, however, that efforts like is being done at Arches, like a visitor use plan that is initiated at Zion, are examples of how the Park Service is facing that. I have to say that in meetings that, and now switching, so that's kind of where the Park Service is from the standpoint of NPCA, we too want people to visit parks. We encourage that kind of awareness, because if people haven't visited parks, they're going to be loath to want to protect them. And so it's important that they have those experiences. A big part of the Second Century Commission was encouraging more diverse visitation of parks, young people. In fact, we have an initiative in April where, Bob mentioned my involvement with something called Neighborhood Housing Services that took court-referred youth on the west side of Salt Lake to build new housing That's now 30 years old, but we're taking a group down to Arches to remove graffiti at Arches, and they'll be in April. And so I think the concept of having West Side youth removing graffiti, which is a problem at Arches and Canyonlands, is a great thing. But I think that the challenge that we face is we can represent that our national parks are sacred spaces, that they need protection, that the redundancy in our name is not intentional, that there are in fact a need to conserve these places. But we have situations where the parks just are really profoundly impacted by this. And so in meetings that we had with the congressional delegation not long ago, and we're talking about the economic value of parks and the visitation, there was I made the comment that the national parks are really not commodities. And I had a representative from one of our congressional delegations say, well, I take issue with that. They are indeed commodities, and they do need to be exploited. And they are for the benefit of the people who live there. And so there's really some strong attitudes that really need to be changed. I had someone else say at some point, the expectation that people have when they go visit a national park, that it's a place of solitude, that it's a place of quiet reflection, opportunities to experience a natural world that you might not always have if, as an urban dweller, that's really what the parks have been and should be. And people have said, well, maybe we need to change that expectation. Sort of the idea that this is kind of like going to Disneyland. You check it off. And so there's a cultural dynamic to that. And it's a long way of answering that question, maybe not even answering it. It's a moving target. From our perspective, the park should be fully funded. They should be enabling people to visit and the parks to be maintained. And efforts like at Zion and Arches that will look at what the carrying capacity of these places are really need to be expanded. Yes, ma'am. And then Steve.
I know this might sound kind of like a sacrilege, but in some parks like Yosemite, the air quality is really affected by the wood burning in the campgrounds. Has there been any consideration about reducing or not permitting campfires in the campgrounds?
I'm not sure I could answer that question. The easy way for me to answer that is Yosemite isn't in my region, but so I don't know. But I do know that those kinds of considerations are, very much a part of what the park managers have to face. And you can imagine that would be a pretty controversial issue, but it is a challenge for sure. Pat, you're right there.
When I was in Interior, we started the bus system in the Grand Canyon and Zions. We also proposed to do one for the Yellowstone Teton area that was vetoed by Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Why doesn't the National Park Conservation Association look at creating virtual tours so that every schoolroom has access through the internet to see Zions in a virtual way, and then set up a more rational transportation system in those places?
Were we that powerful? I would love to do that. I know that the Park Service has initiated in several of their parks a virtual system, and that's, I think, part of how the Department of Interior and Sally Jewell, in her efforts to promote younger people in the parks, has been advancing that. I know that there have been efforts to expand the broadband capabilities for parks and people visiting the parks. The idea of, if the second part of your question is expanding better transportation systems in parks, I know that there's a double-edged sword to that the shuttle system at Zion has been an incredible benefit and made the canyon a easier place, a quieter place to visit. The downside from the park management is that one of the capacity constraints was the parking lots. And so as you had more shuttles, you had more people on the trails, you had more challenges maintaining the trails. And And then I know that the park is facing the challenges of replacing the shuttles that are expensive. And I think some of the solutions, and we have been advocating for decades about this, is how important it is to fulfill the covenant we have with the national parks with their creation, that they be funded adequately. I mean, I see every day how challenging it is for them to be able to manage, what they're responsible for and how they have to do that. And better visitor services, better management, better protection is all inherent in the funding of that. Steve? Okay.
Yeah, so much of what you've talked about, Dave, has to do with funding. You talked about things you wanted or hoped the Obama administration would do before the end of the Obama's term, but funding's all about Congress, and you have to get bills through Congress. Are there champions for national parks in Congress that we all should know about? Because someone's got to take the lead there to make this happen.
There is a Centennial challenge, and there's a caucus of people that are advancing that. Primarily, they're Democrats, and Democrats are not in strong positions presently to make that difference. There's and so we're in the midst of trying to identify some more moderate Republicans, for example, Cory Gardner in Colorado as a possible champion, Lamar Alexander in Tennessee, Rob Portman in Ohio, are people that have been particularly attentive to that. What I would ask is, and I encourage you to visit our website, as will be actually NPCA has created a 501c4 organization, and one of the things, while we're not going to be doing campaigning and electioneering, we are going to be giving scorecards on really relevant park issues that will allow the public to look at those who are real champions and are doing park-related work. But I think part of that is in this really toxic political environment, and with limits that the administration can follow in terms of this and getting budgets through. The president's budget, by the way, which was pronounced to be DOA and is not even getting consideration, adds a fairly substantial bump to park funding in the Centennial year. But I don't know how it's going to get supported, and it is not certainly something that the Utah delegation has been supportive of. Although I would say that Rob Bishop is going to be a co-sponsor, as we understand, of a Centennial bill that will allow for a match of public dollars and philanthropy that will substantially augment some of the park funding. That's what I hear. This gentleman.
Do national park concessionaires hire mostly seasonal youth from overseas?
Well, it certainly seems that way. It didn't used to be, but that's how it is. I don't believe there are any kind of restrictions that govern who work for concessionaires. I would have to say part of the problem in being able to regulate the money coming into the parks really it comes from the concession contracts themselves. And one of the challenges, for example, just recently resolved at the Grand Canyon was something called leasehold surrender interest. Over the almost 100 years that concessionaires, starting with the Fred Harvey Company at the Grand Canyon, built up essentially equity in using the facilities of the federal government, that they had as much as $200 million at one time of LSI, as it was called, which means that in order for them to get a return on their investment, the amount of money they would provide to the Park Service as a royalty for the 4.5 million people that would come there would be very, very small. And so through a lot of borrowing and whatnot, the Park Service was able to pay down that leasehold surrender interest. And so the concessionaires go through a fairly rigorous process of defining what kind of return they can get, and maybe part of that might require that they hire people, from Romania. I don't know. I mean, but there are no requirements, as far as I know, that regulate that. Yes, sir.
Kind of tagging on to that question, I'm curious about the National Park Service concessionaires and if they are able to lobby to shape any policy in the parks, and if they do, how do they kind of affect the balance that the parks are trying to maintain?
Well, fortunately, the Park Service has, there's a competitive process, or should be a competitive process. The previous example I gave at the Grand Canyon, that in order for a new concessionaire to come in, they'd have to pay down the leasehold surrender interest, makes it almost a non-competitive environment. But presently, the concessionaires and the movement to at least have competitive bidding has allowed the concessionaires to really fulfill the expectations that the Park Service has through this every 10-year bidding process. So that might mean that they, need to be more green, more sustainable. It may mean that they need to hire local people, not that I know if that is something that they do. There's a current flap that amounts to the trademarking of park names. The Ahwahnee at Yosemite is one that Delaware North maintains they own. And I think that was just today, if I'm not mistaken, that they, that was supposed to change. I don't know. Again, that's not in my region, so I don't know. But there was something, for example, that Xanterra wanted to trademark El Tovar, that they own that at the Grand Canyon. And so they would add value through that process. And that's, as far as I know, the kind of extent that they would have license to influence park policies. But it's certainly better that the Park Service can get competitive bids and get closer to what they want from a concessionaire rather than be held hostage. And I know we're about out of time.
I think we've got to call it at this point. Let me thank David again for joining us. Let me thank you for joining us. Let me remind you about the 21st Annual Symposium coming up. Check the Stegner Center website, and we'll see you back here